Even muffled by the thick concrete walls, the sound cut through the humid night air like a distress signal. It wasn't the sound of machinery, it was the frantic, uneven rattle of someone fighting against cold steel. To anyone else, it was a warning to keep walking. To KIANA, it felt like the only thing in this neighborhood louder than her own heartbeat. KIANA is a fitness-worn survivor who has taken this specific shortcut through the industrial lot for 2 years to avoid the late-night harassment on the main boulevard. She is currently vibrating with exhaustion, her hands still trembling from a double shift under Bernice Holloway, a boss who has spent the last month looking for any excuse to fire her. Between a final warning for her attitude and a stack of overdue utility bills waiting at home, KIANA knows she cannot afford to be a witness. Her survival depends on being invisible. However, as she stares at the heavy warehouse door, she is paralyzed by a memory of her own moments of helplessness. She realizes she has a refusal to look away complex that her bank account simply can't afford. Steeling herself, KIANA reaches into her gear bag and grips the heavy-duty bolt cutters she'd salvaged from a construction site. She slips into the darkness of the warehouse, descending into a basement that reeks of rust and damp earth. Moving through a high-contrast graveyard of shadows and orange service lights, she finds him, Ji-Hoon Kwon. He is anchored to a concrete pillar, wrapped in heavy chains that bite into his torn white dress shirt. He is blood-smeared, battered, and barely conscious, a man clearly left there to be erased by the clock. KIANA knows the face from the news, he is the Shadow King of the city's underworld. Just as she positions the bolt cutters over the primary lock, the heavy thud of a van door echoes from the loading dock above. Footsteps. Heavy, synchronized, and closing in. KIANA has seconds to choose, run and stay invisible, or cut the chain and join a war. She looks into the dying eyes of the man on the pillar and squeezes the handles. The fluorescent lights of the clean and clear commercial laundry facility didn't just illuminate the room, they hummed with a low-frequency vibration that seemed to rattle KIANA's very teeth. It was 10:45 p.m., and the air was a thick, humid soup of industrial detergent and overheated steam. KIANA's forearms ached, the muscles twitching from 8 straight hours of hauling damp, heavy linens into the industrial dryers. Vance. If I see you leaning, I see you leaving. The voice belonged to Bernice Holloway, a woman whose personality was as abrasive as the bleach she rationed like liquid gold. Bernice marched across the linoleum, her heels clicking like a metronome of impending doom. She stopped inches from KIANA, waving a crumpled sheet of paper. This is your second final warning, KIANA. I had a client complain that their linen smelled like, what did they call it? Exhaustion. You're slow, you're sullen, and frankly, you're replaceable. KIANA didn't look up, focusing instead on the rhythmic fold of a white tablecloth. She felt the heat rising in her neck, that familiar spark of defiance she usually had to swallow just to keep a roof over her head. The dryer in Bank 4 is overheating, Bernice. I was trying to calibrate it so we didn't start a fire. Don't you give me attitude, Bernice snapped, leaning in so close KIANA could smell the peppermint she chewed to mask her coffee breath. You think you're special because you've got those muscles? You're a pair of hands, Vance. Hands I can find at any bus stop for $5 less an hour. One more word, and you can take your bike and find a new place to spend your nights. Bernice spun on her heel, leaving a trail of cheap perfume in the steam. KIANA's grip tightened on the fabric until her knuckles turned ash gray. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the folded shut-off notice from the electric company, $340. That was the price of light and heat, and she was exactly $340 short. She looked at her reflection in the darkened window of the break room, a young woman slick with sweat, eyes wide with a mixture of simmering rage and bone-deep fatigue. She felt like she was drowning in a glass of water, held down by the weight of 1,000 small, crushing pressures. As the clock finally hit 11 p.m., KIANA punched out, the mechanical thud of the time card sounding like a gavel. She grabbed her bag, feeling the heavy, reassuring weight of the bolt cutters she'd scavenged earlier that week, a tool for a side hustle that hadn't materialized yet. She pushed her bike out into the cool night air, the silence of the industrial district a sharp contrast to Bernice's screaming. She just wanted to go home. She just wanted to be invisible. But as she neared the Miller warehouse, the universe had other plans. The cool night air should have been a relief, but it felt heavy against KIANA's skin, thick with the scent of damp pavement and industrial grease. She pedaled her bike slowly, her legs feeling like lead weights after the shift with Bernice. The industrial district was a ghost town at this hour, a labyrinth of corrugated metal and chain-link fences that usually offered a hollow kind of peace. She was passing the rusted gates of the Miller warehouse, a sprawling, windowless monolith that had been slated for demolition for years, when the silence broke. It wasn't a loud noise. It was a rhythmic, wet thud, followed by the unmistakable screech of metal dragging over grit. KIANA braked, her sneakers skidding on the gravel. She remained perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Keep moving, KIANA," she told herself. "You're tired. You're imagining things." Then came the groan. It was low, guttural, and jagged with pain, the kind of sound a person makes when they've run out of breath to scream. It didn't sound like a squatter or a stray animal. It sounded like a man dying. KIANA looked down at her handlebars. She thought of the shut-off notice in her pocket and Bernice's voice ringing in her ears. The world had spent all day telling her she was invisible, that she didn't matter. If she vanished into the night right now, no one would come looking for her. The sound came again, followed by a sharp, metallic clank that echoed off the warehouse walls. Instead of pedaling away, KIANA dismounted. Her boots crunched softly on the debris as she guided her bike toward the shadows of a loading dock. She felt a strange, magnetic pull toward the source of the agony. It was a defiance she couldn't explain, a refusal to let one more thing in this neighborhood go unnoticed. She reached into her bag, her fingers locking around the cold, industrial handles of the bolt cutters. The weight of the tool was grounding. She wasn't a victim, she was a woman with a plan. The warehouse door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning from the threshold. As she approached, the smell hit her, not just the usual rust and mold, but the sharp, copper tang of fresh blood. The dragging sound was louder now, coming from deep within the belly of the building, vibrating up through the soles of her shoes. She took a breath, adjusted her grip on the heavy steel tool, and stepped into the black. The darkness inside the warehouse was absolute, a thick, velvet weight that seemed to swallow the beam of KIANA's phone flashlight. She moved with a predator's caution, her breath shallow and controlled. The air here was different, stale and cold, tasting of ancient dust, oxidized iron, and a dampness that clung to the back of her throat. Every step felt like an intrusion. The floorboards groaned beneath her weight, a treacherous sound that seemed to echo for miles in the hollow expanse. To her left, the skeletal remains of old machinery loomed like prehistoric beasts, their jagged edges casting long, distorted shadows that danced in the periphery of her vision. She reached the head of the basement stairs. The door had been ripped off its hinges, leaving a gaping black maw that led straight down into the earth. The smell of copper was stronger here, mixed with the chemical sting of cleaning fluid, a sterile scent that felt violent in such a decayed place. KIANA hesitated, her hand tightening around the red handles of the bolt cutters. Her survival instinct, honed by years of navigating the sharp edges of the city, was screaming at her to turn back. This wasn't just a trespass, it was a descent into a place where the rules of the surface no longer applied. The silence down there was heavy, pressurized, as if the basement itself were holding its breath. She began to descend. The wooden stairs were slick with moisture, forcing her to brace one hand against the rough concrete wall. With every step downward, the temperature dropped. The faint, rhythmic clinking of chains grew louder, no longer a distant echo but a physical vibration in the air. Halfway down, she froze. A floorboard creaked somewhere above her. She killed her light instantly, plunging herself into a sensory deprivation so sudden it made her head swim. She pressed her back against the cold concrete, the rough texture catching on her sleeveless top. She waited, her pulse thundering in her ears, listening for footsteps or the click of a hammer being pulled back. There was nothing but the distant, agonized wheeze of the person below. The basement felt like a trap, a concrete box designed to bury secrets. KIANA realized that if the door above were to shut, she would be erased, just another missing person in a city that didn't keep count. But the memory of that raw, guttural groan pushed her forward. She reached the bottom step, her boots touching a floor that felt sticky with something other than water. She clicked the light back on, and the beam cut through the dust motes to reveal the first glint of silver chain. The beam of KIANA's light cut through the haze of the basement, landing first on a pair of polished leather shoes, now scuffed and coated in gray dust. She panned the light upward, and the breath hitched in her throat. Bound to a central concrete pillar was a man who looked like he had been put through a meat grinder. He was Korean, his handsome features distorted by a map of violence. A deep purple hematoma swelled over his left cheekbone, and a jagged cut above his eyebrow had leaked a curtain of blood that had dried into dark, rust-colored streaks down his face. His white dress shirt, once crisp and expensive-looking, was shredded and saturated with crimson, clinging to his torso like a second, macabre skin. But it was the chains that made KIANA's stomach turn. Thick, industrial-grade steel links were wrapped brutally around his chest and shoulders, anchoring him so tightly to the pillar that his spine was forced into an unnatural arch. The metal bit into his skin, bruising the flesh beneath the torn fabric. He was suspended more than he was sitting, his head lolling back against the cold stone, eyes closed. "Hey," KIANA whispered, her voice cracking in the tomb-like silence. The man's eyelids flickered. It took a visible, agonizing effort for him to lift his head. When his eyes finally met hers, they weren't just the eyes of a victim. Even through the haze of pain and blood loss, there was a sharp, predatory coldness in his gaze, a flicker of the feared Mafia boss, Ji-Hoon Kwon, refusing to go out quietly. His mouth opened, but only a wet, rattling wheeze came out. His lips were cracked and stained with blood. He looked at KIANA, then at the heavy bolt cutters gripped in her shaking hands. For a second, a flash of genuine shock crossed his battered face. He hadn't expected a savior, and he certainly hadn't expected her, a young woman in athletic gear, sweat-slicked and wide-eyed, standing in the middle of his execution chamber. The basement air felt even heavier now, thick with the smell of his impending death. KIANA stepped closer, the light of her phone dancing over the chains. She could see where the metal had been cinched tight with a heavy-duty padlock. He was meant to stay here until his heart stopped, a human message left in the dark. "I'm getting you out," she breathed, though she wasn't sure if she was promising him or convincing herself. Ji-Hoon's gaze drifted past her, toward the stairs she had just descended. He tried to speak again, his voice a scorched rasp that barely carried. "Run," he choked out, the single word costing him everything he had left. "They, come back." The word run echoed in the damp cellar, vibrating against the concrete walls and chilling KIANA to the bone. Her survival instinct, the one that had kept her safe in a city that chewed up people like her, surged with terrifying force. Every muscle in her leg screamed at her to turn around, to sprint up those stairs, and to forget she had ever seen the man in the white shirt. If she left now, she was just a girl who heard a noise. If she stayed, she was an accomplice to whatever war had landed him here. She looked at the exit, then back at Ji-Hoon. He was watching her, his breathing shallow and jagged. He looked like he had already accepted his fate, his eyes drifting shut as if the mere effort of warning her had drained his final reserves. KIANA thought of Bernice's sneer, the shut-off notice, and the suffocating feeling of being powerless. She was tired of watching things break. She was tired of being the one who stayed invisible while the world did its worst. "Not tonight," she hissed, her voice sounding steadier than she felt. She stepped forward, the heavy-duty bolt cutters feeling like an extension of her own rage. She didn't just grab the handles, she gripped them like a lifeline. She bypassed the lock, it was too thick, too reinforced, and aimed instead for the weakest link in the chain cinching his chest. She braced her feet against the gritty floor, her athletic frame coiling like a spring. She positioned the hardened steel jaws of the tool around the metal link. Her muscles, already sore from her shift at the laundry, burned as she poured every ounce of her strength into the handles. Think of the bills. Think of Bernice. Think of every time you were told to stay in your place. The steel resisted for a heartbeat, a stubborn, silent standoff between KIANA and the Mafia's cruelty. Then, with a sharp, violent crack that sounded like a gunshot in the small room, the link snapped. The chain slackened instantly. Ji-Hoon lurched forward, his weight no longer supported by the pillar. KIANA dropped one handle of the cutters to catch him, her muscular shoulder bracing his chest to keep him from collapsing face first into the dirt. He was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and blood, and the smell of him, expensive cologne mixed with the metallic tang of injury, filled her senses. "I've got you," she whispered, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She reached for the next chain, the one anchoring his waist, but as the steel jaws bit into the second link, a new sound drifted down from the warehouse floor above. A heavy door creaked open. The muffled thud of boots hit the floorboards directly over their heads. The men were back. The snap of the second chain was a thunderclap in the silence, but it was immediately drowned out by the heavy, rhythmic thud-thud-thud of boots on the floorboards above. KIANA froze, her pulse leaping into her throat. Above them, muffled voices spoke in sharp, clipped Korean, tones of casual brutality that made the hair on her arms stand up. A beam of light swept across the open stairwell door upstairs, momentarily slashing through the basement's darkness like a blade. "They're here," she breathed, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. She wasn't just a bystander anymore, she was a target. She looked at Ji-Hoon. He was slumping, his strength spent, his eyes glazed with the onset of shock. If she left him now, they would finish what they started. If she stayed, they'd kill her just for seeing his face. KIANA acted on pure, adrenaline-fueled instinct. She shoved the bolt cutters into her gear bag and hooked her arms under Ji-Hoon's pits. He was a solid mass of muscle, and dragging him felt like pulling an anchor, but her athletic frame held. She hauled him backward, his heels dragging through the dust, into the deep shadows behind a row of rusted industrial furnaces. The basement stairs groaned. Someone was coming down. KIANA scanned the darkness, her mind racing. Her eyes landed on a stack of old, moth-eaten canvas tarps and a pile of discarded chemical drums. She shoved Ji-Hoon into the narrow gap between the furnace and the wall, throwing a heavy tarp over him. "Don't make a sound," she whispered, though he looked barely conscious enough to breathe. She didn't hide with him. She knew the layout, the basement was a dead end unless she created a path. She spotted a heavy glass bottle on a workbench and a gallon of industrial solvent. Remembering the fire plan she had visualized, she moved with frantic precision. She didn't have time for a fuse, but she had a lighter in her pocket from the break room. As the first man's boots hit the basement floor, his flashlight cutting through the dark, KIANA threw the bottle toward the far corner of the room, away from their hiding spot. It shattered, the liquid pooling instantly. She flicked the lighter and tossed it. Whoosh! A wall of blue and orange flame erupted, licking the ceiling and sending a thick, acrid cloud of smoke billowing through the cramped space. "Fire!" she screamed, her voice a piercing, panicked shriek that echoed off the walls. "Fire! It's going to blow." The intruders hesitated, their flashlight beams dancing wildly in the smoke. The confusion was her only window. In the chaos of the flickering orange light and the choking haze, KIANA grabbed Ji-Hoon again. With a strength born of pure terror, she hauled him toward the narrow coal chute she'd spotted earlier, a small, rusted opening that led to the alley. She pushed him through the hatch first, then scrambled after him, the sound of the men's angry shouting fading as she tumbled out into the cold, sweet night air. The small, fourth-floor walk-up felt like a sanctuary until KIANA crossed the threshold, dragging the weight of a dying man into her living room. The air was still warm from the day's heat, smelling of the lavender incense she burned to drown out the city's exhaust. Now, it smelled of iron and ozone. She lowered Ji-Hoon onto her worn velvet sofa, the only nice thing she owned. He collapsed into the cushions, his head lolling to the side, his skin an ashen gray that looked terrifying under the soft glow of her floor lamp. KIANA moved with frantic efficiency, grabbing her first aid kit and a bowl of warm water. As she cut away the remains of his white shirt, the true scale of the violence became clear. This wasn't just a mugging, it was a surgical dismantling. His chest was a mosaic of deep bruises and jagged lacerations, and the chain marks had left raw, weeping welts across his collarbones. Every time she dabbed a damp cloth against his skin, he let out a low, subconscious hiss of pain. "Who are you?" she whispered, more to herself than him. Her answer came when she moved his discarded coat. A heavy, black steel handgun fell to the floor with a dull thud, followed by a leather wallet. Inside, she didn't find a driver's license, but a black card embossed with a gold lotus, and a name that made the blood drain from her face. Ji-Hoon Kwon. She'd seen that name on news crawls about untraceable crime syndicates. She wasn't just helping a victim. She was harboring a ghost. Her phone began to vibrate violently on the coffee table. The caller ID read Bernice, work. KIANA stared at it, her hand stained with Ji-Hoon's blood. She had missed her check-in for the midnight cleanup. She hadn't even called. She picked up. Before she could speak, Bernice's voice shrieked through the speaker. "Don't bother coming in, Vance. I told you, one more strike. I've already got a girl in your spot who actually wants to work. Don't show your face here for your final check. I'll mail it, minus the cost of the uniforms you ruined." The line went dead. KIANA dropped the phone. The silence that followed was suffocating. She had no job, no rent money for next week, and a man on her couch who was currently the most hunted person in the city. Her stable, invisible life had evaporated in a single hour. Ji-Hoon's hand suddenly shot out, his fingers, cold and trembling, locking around her wrist with surprising strength. His eyes were open now, dark and unfocused, but sharp with a sudden, desperate clarity. "You shouldn't have brought me here," he rasped, his voice a ghost of a sound. "They don't leave witnesses." KIANA looked at her wrist, then at the blood on her hands. She had crossed a line she couldn't see, and there was no going back. The apartment felt smaller than it had 10 minutes ago, the walls closing in as the gravity of Ji-Hoon's presence settled over the room. KIANA sat on the edge of the coffee table, her heart still reeling from Bernice's final, bridge-burning phone call. She was jobless and broke, and the man bleeding onto her furniture was the reason why. Ji-Hoon struggled to sit up, his breath hitching as he leaned against the arm of the sofa. The soft lamplight caught the sharp angles of his face, making him look less like a victim and more like the dangerous entity the headlines described. He watched her carefully, his gaze lingering on her muscular, sweat-slicked arms and the steady way she held his gaze despite the fear vibrating in the air. "You know my name," he said, the rasp in his voice turning into a cold, low baritone. It wasn't a question. "I know enough," KIANA replied, wringing out a red-stained cloth. "I know you're not supposed to be in a basement in this neighborhood. And I know the people who put you there are going to be looking for you." Ji-Hoon leaned his head back, his eyes narrowing. "They aren't just looking for me, KIANA. They are looking to erase me. The men you saw, they belong to the Iron Lotus. They've spent a decade in the shadows of my territory, waiting for a single fracture. They found it." He paused, a flicker of genuine bitterness crossing his face. "I was betrayed by someone in my inner circle. Someone I called brother handed me to them like a gift." The name Iron Lotus sounded like a death sentence. KIANA had heard whispers of them, a rival group known for a level of brutality that even the city's seasoned detectives avoided mentioning. They didn't just kill their enemies, they made examples of them. They wanted a public execution, Ji-Hoon continued, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. To leave a mafia boss to rot in a basement sends a message to every other family in this city. It tells them the old guard is dead. By taking me out of that room, you didn't just save a life. You interrupted a coronation. KIANA stood up, pacing the small stretch of linoleum between the kitchen and the couch. So what now? I've lost my job. I've burned my life to the ground for a man who's a walking target. What happens when they realize you didn't die in that fire? Ji-Hoon reached out, his movements slow but deliberate. He tapped the gold Lotus card on the table. The Iron Lotus does not leave loose ends. To them, you are no longer a civilian. You are the woman who stole their victory. The tension in the room was snapped by a sound KIANA had been dreading, the unmistakable, rhythmic heavy beat of a high-performance engine idling in the alleyway 4 floors down. Then, the silence of the hallway died. No footsteps, just the sudden, violent splintering of her front door frame. KIANA didn't have time to scream. A man surged into the apartment like a shadow made of muscle and suit fabric. He was tall, his hair cropped close, his eyes scanning the room with a lethality that made the air turn cold. Before KIANA could reach for the bolt cutters, the man had her pinned against the kitchen counter, his forearm pressed against her throat with the force of a hydraulic press. "Where is he?" the man hissed. His voice was a serrated blade. This was Sang-min, Ji-Hoon's most loyal enforcer, and he looked ready to tear the building down to find his boss. KIANA struggled, her athletic frame tensing as she tried to wedge her hand between his arm and her windpipe. "Get off me," she wheezed, her eyes defiant even as black spots danced in her vision. "Sang-min, stop." The command was weak, coming from the sofa, but it acted like a physical tether. Sang-min froze, his gaze shifting to the bruised, bandaged man reclining on the velvet cushions. He didn't release KIANA immediately, his eyes darted between her sweat-slicked face, the blood-stained cloths in the sink, and the open first aid kit. "Boss?" Sang-min's voice wavered, the coldness replaced by a jarring note of shock. He looked at Ji-Hoon, then back at KIANA, his grip finally loosening. He stepped back, his hand hovering near the holster tucked inside his jacket. "Who is she? Is she with the Lotus?" "She's the reason I am breathing," Ji-Hoon said, his voice straining. "She found me. She cut the chains. She got me through the fire while your security detail was busy being slaughtered." Sang-min looked at KIANA's muscular arms, noting the fresh burns on her skin and the industrial bolt cutters sitting on the table. The suspicion in his eyes began to melt into a confusing mixture of shame and gratitude. He realized that this girl, a civilian with no stake in their war, had done what his entire tactical team had failed to do. "You saved him?" Sang-min asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. KIANA rubbed her throat, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked at the two men, one a battered king, the other a lethal protector, and realized the world she knew was gone. "I didn't save a boss," she said, her voice trembling but hard. "I saved a person. And now his war is in my kitchen." Sang-min bowed his head slightly, a gesture of profound respect that felt alien in her small apartment. "Then his war is our debt. But the Lotus is coming, and we have to move. Now." The apartment transformed into a sterile battlefield within minutes. Dr. Hanul-Oh, a woman whose calm was as sharp as her scalpel, arrived with a compact surgical kit that smelled of antiseptic and high-stakes secrets. KIANA stood in the corner of her own kitchen, watching as the kitchen table, where she usually ate cereal and balanced her mounting bills, became an operating theater. The light from KIANA's floor lamp flickered as Hanul worked. Sang-min stood guard by the shattered door, his hand never straying from his weapon, his eyes tracking every shadow in the hallway. The air was thick with the copper tang of blood and the hushed, urgent murmurs of the doctor. KIANA provided the water and held the light steady, her hands surprisingly firm despite the adrenaline crash threatening to pull her under. She watched the way Hanul's needle dipped in and out of Ji-Hoon's skin, stitching the Mafia boss back together link by agonizing link. When the sun began to bleed a pale, bruised purple over the city skyline, Hanul finally stepped back, peeling off her latex gloves. "He's stable," she whispered. "He's strong, but he won't be fighting for weeks." Ji-Hoon's eyes opened, finding KIANA in the dim light. He didn't speak, but the look he gave her was a heavy, silent vow, a recognition that she was no longer just a bystander who had stumbled into a basement. She was the anchor that had kept him from drifting into the dark. "You can't stay here," Sang-min said, his voice dropping into a protective rumble. "The Lotus burned the warehouse. They'll find the coal chute, and they'll track the blood. By noon, this building won't be safe for a stray cat, let alone the woman who humiliated them." KIANA looked around her small home, the velvet sofa, the lavender incense, the life she had struggled so hard to keep stable. It was all gone. Bernice had taken her job, and the Iron Lotus had taken her safety. "Pack a bag," Ji-Hoon rasped from the table, his hand reaching out to find hers. "You're under my protection now, KIANA. For as long as I have a name in this city, you are part of it." As they moved her toward a black SUV waiting in the alley, KIANA felt the shift in the air. She wasn't the invisible girl anymore. She was a loose end in a war of titans. Across the city, in a high-rise made of glass and cold ambition, the leaders of the Iron Lotus stared at the charred remains of the warehouse. They didn't see a girl, they saw a ghost that had stolen their prize. They swore a silent, blood-soaked oath. The woman with the bolt cutters wouldn't just be killed, she would be erased. KIANA climbed into the car, the weight of the bolt cutters still in her bag, and watched her old life vanish in the rearview mirror. The war had officially begun.